Good Shabbos, good Shabbos. So, based on the story of this week's Torah portion, King David says in chapter 80 of Psalms, O shepherd of Israel. Here we're being called by Jacob. Jacob's second name was Israel. Hearken, he who leads Joseph like flocks. Here we're being called by the name of Joseph. Now, Jacob is one of the forefathers, okay, but Joseph is only one of the sons, only one of the tribes. So why are we all being called by the name Joseph? And the answer is a story in this week's Torah portion that Joseph was mefarnes us. He sustained us in the time of suffering. The time of hunger, when we all went down to Egypt, it was Joseph who sustained us. Now, the word mefarnes doesn't just mean to sustain in a way of surviving. Mefarnes also means that it's a livelihood, and that can be more than just surviving. Now, let us understand a little bit of what's going on here. We're called by Jacob's name Israel. We're called by Joseph. What's going on here? So to understand this, we need to understand the difference between the forefathers and the tribes, between Jacob and the rest of the forefathers, and between Joseph and the rest of the tribes. So let us begin. The reason why the tribes had to become shepherds is because their engagement in the world would have affected their spirituality. And thus, by need, they became shepherds to remain isolated from the world. Now, the forefathers were shepherds, but they didn't do it because they needed to do it. They actually did it as an outcome of who they were. They could not be affected by the world because they stood in a spirituality that was above and beyond the world, in which the world was considered naught. It had no effect on them. And thus they didn't engage in it. They remained aloof from it. Not because they were afraid that the world would affect them like the 12 tribes, 11 tribes had to, but it was an outcome of their spirituality. And thus their impact on the world was from above. Now, amongst the forefathers, Jacob stands alone in the sense that Abraham and Isaac were never in exile, while Jacob experienced exile first by his father-in-law, and then later when he was the one that had to go down to Egypt. And nevertheless, even in exile, he stayed aloft, and from where he was up high, he affected the world. And thus we find that after 2 years of hunger, there was supposed to be 7 years, Jacob comes, blesses Pharaoh, and the hunger is over. So it wasn't that he engaged within Egypt, rather from being above and beyond, he blessed Egypt, and the exile changed, and there was no more hunger. Now let's talk about Joseph. Joseph isn't a shepherd. He is engaging in leadership, even when he becomes a slave of Potiphar's house, even when he's in prison, and even when he is the viceroy of Egypt. Now, interesting enough, he engages with the exile, and he is in exile. He was a slave, he was a prisoner, and he did have Pharaoh above him even when he was viceroy. But nevertheless, his engagement with exile transformed the exile itself. And thus there is the difference between even him and Jacob, that he takes Jacob's energy to a whole new level. Not that we need to stand above and detached from exile, just shining on it from above, but rather going into exile, dealing with exile, we transform the exile. And Joseph does that by every time it's being said about him, by his master Potiphar, by the head of the prison, and by Pharaoh. They all said the words, and we see that God is with you and you are successful. Thus Joseph goes into exile, engages with exile, but he has God right there with him, and thus he transforms exile. And the way the Rebbe would say it is, the word exile is gola. The letter Aleph represents God. When you bring the Aleph into gola, you have geula. Geula means redemption. And thus the ultimate power that we have after we told God, O shepherd of Israel, we go even further and higher than this. He who leads Joseph. Meaning that not only do we stand from our spirituality above and beyond exile, but even with our body that goes into exile, God gives us the energy that Joseph has within exile to become the viceroy, to transform exile, and not to have to leave exile, but to turn exile itself into redemption. And that's the power of the story of Joseph.